Okay.
So I'll be able to hear just downstairs if everything's working.
Okay.
Oh, you're coming then. Oh, I didn't realise it wasn't like an invite. Yeah, I'm coming really free. Like, oh, okay.
Thank you. Yes, I did change my glasses specifically to match as well. Yeah, Positive Birth. They make a series of T-shirts, and there's one that's Positive Birth Movement.
Okay.
There's about 15 different designs, something like that. Yeah, and they make them like the different services sizes with different fruit, so stages of dilation, and there's a spiral and a lot of positive birth phrases, and it's all supporting the positive birth movement, which is quite good. And boost your T-shirt as well, your wardrobe. If you wear them all the time, I guess you get your use out of them.
And actually, I'm intended to have a conversation with you two about what to wear and what you were going to wear.
And then I felt ultra girly doing that. Because I nearly went, what are you wearing? But I was like, I can't
Nothing
do
wrong with that. No, you could do that.
And I had to
We're not professionals.
message Georgie yesterday.
Yes, yes.
I had to message her the day before yesterday and go, do you have a hairdryer?
Yeah.
Because I just had this new haircut done and I can't style it without a hairdryer.
Did you even use it? I didn't hear it.
Yeah.
My hair is kind of normally forward, but I realised yesterday that actually it's grown so much that it kind of goes flat at the back, and then I've got a really long fringe thing that I kind of just put to the side, and I look like my dad in his 20s. So I was like, I'm just going to have to do something different. So I was like, oh, have a head scarf. Always falls off. I've got small hands, weird shaped, non-existent head. It's pinhead. I can wear children's helmets and hats and children's glasses.
Useful indeed. Cheaper.
Yeah, but weird. Nothing adult fits me.
Oh yes. But you're not. Like,
I'm not abnormally sized anywhere else. But
just your feet aren't particular. Like, I don't want to hear people talk about.
fine.
No, exactly. So you've got normal sized feet.
I should have my heels on and I can see stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm just going to stand. I won't stand there because it's blinding.
Yeah, this is the problem I'm trying to figure out.
You
Yeah.
have to stand here
Yeah.
and read just. Oh,
Like where to get blinded by the light.
Anywhere here, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Anyway, unless you stand right in the corner.
And that's just a bit weird.
Yeah. then just step like this.
Like,
I'm going to stand
I stand here.
if you
and
stand
I'm going to be
by the front of it, then you might be out.
Yeah. And I won't be able to see what I'm doing. That's right. I'll just.
Only because you're shorter than him.
And yeah,
Are
maybe
we
it's your
standing
tool.
next to you or are we sitting down when you talk? And then
Whatever's easier.
When are we going to get these?
You sound here, you sound fine in here, you sound fine.
Georgie's here.
Splendid.
Oh, yes, we do. We have
Your Fran. Fran. We do. Don't worry. You're going to get a stash, and there's 100 or so for you downstairs. I'm going to put the timer on so I actually don't go too far talking.
My bit of talk.
Make sure.
15 minutes or 10. So I'm going to say 10. Can I just do 10? That's fine. Is it 10 or 15 that we've got each?
12.
12. Go with 10 then, because then I can oversee.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, I mean, I have not figured out how long I'm going to talk for at all. I just have. And
I just know I'm going to talk
there's a
too
clock
much.
there, so I'm just going to keep.
Oh,
Yeah.
good point.
Well, in the reason there's a clock there, so
Yeah, because I don't really want an alarm going off.
no.
Right, so
That's a really, really good point. I'm going to take that timer off now.
Yep, I'm done now.
Yeah.
Hand
And
over.
If you want to know how long it's been, just put this.
just going to put the switch on. Didn't even think of that. Good idea. And you know what? I left us 15 minutes. I left us 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So if we go over a little bit, or if we go under a little bit, that's also fine.
I'm pretty sure I can hear from your lungs and your chest.
Yeah, probably. But this is auditory. No, I'm just not going to talk directly into it for a second. Yeah. Joe is coming to introduce us, so we know when we're starting. So there's a nice defined kind of beginning. Just kidding. Someone behind you. Yes. It's very warm.
We need to come back these early.
There's some interesting facts right here.
I think I recognise the lady with the long grey hair.
That's Shell Banks,
Why do I know
IBCLC from the Channel 4 Dispatches.
That'll be why. Did we meet her at the thingy?
We met her at the ABM conference. We weren't there. No, she was. She was in London. Yes, at the MPPG. Yes. She was sitting with Emma Pickett, ABM type people.
I think I might have asked her if she was someone else, so she was walking downstairs. She was
Yes.
like, no, I'm not. Oh, okay. Then.
She's infant feeding, so she's IBCLC, but she's an independent person. She used to be with BFN helpline, and then we did training with them, but now she's independent IBCLC without any affiliation, but she's gets to everything. And she's very well known apparently. Which is why she was on. I asked the woman who presented the Channel 4 dispatches, she was sitting at the end of the room, she was sitting at the end of the APPG room, feeding her child, and I was like, oh, so why are you here? She's like, I presented, I'm the person who made that documentary, like, I'm the presenter. I'm like, oh, sorry, I don't have a TV, I have no idea. No, there's before. Before.
But I'd seen it on telly, and I turned. Was it you? I turned around to. I went.
Just done a really technical announcement by shouting over the thing outside, like, come upstairs.
That's really rude. We were like, oh my god, Joe's not here, what do we do?
Sorry. I was just sat doing some social media stuff, and I was like, oh my god, I do it.
It's fine. It's fine.
And they were just like, that was on telly. And I went, oh, that'll be well.
Yeah, that's why we're here.
It's when you go to someone and go, oh, shit, it's lying to you from somewhere.
Might have done that with someone. And it was Blue Peach presenter. Hi, everybody.
Just about to introduce our penultimate talk of the festival. I am just going to sneak in with another request, please, for anyone who's picked up a copy of Lindsay's book. If you have got it, if you pop it back. Honestly, you're not in trouble. It's just that we would like them back if possible. So you will keep hearing that.
Paid for would also be
All paid for them. But yes, that aside, Parenting Science Gang. So this is a group of parent volunteers who are supported by scientists and experts, and who work through Facebook to research topics that are of interest and are really important to parents. And we are joined today by Georgie and Rachel and Danny. Welcome.
Hello. Just before we start, what we're showing today, there's a lot of preliminary research results from data and the studies, which we haven't got through to publishing yet, so none of it can be tweeted or displayed or recorded yet, please. Otherwise the journals will turn us down and we'll never get the information out there. So there is one slide that we can tweet, and when we get to that point I'll let you know. So, this is a Parenting Science Gang. We are a group of people who... You can photograph this. It's just when I get to the information bit is not working. We are a group of adults, mostly grown-up behaved, and so we get together and get very excited. We came across a lot of questions as parents who we couldn't answer. And Parenting Science Gang started when Sophia Collins, she was trying to wash her cloth nappies, and she had absolutely no idea what the best way of doing it was. And so she looked on the internet, asked questions on Facebook and social media like most of us do, and there was no evidence-based answer. And being a science research person, she decided she was going to set up a group and say, how do I best wash these cloth nappies? And she crowdsourced it, and she got a group of adults, all parents of children of varying ages, and said, right, well, let's find out how we do this. And she got the information, and she said, you know what, I'm pretty good at setting fires under people who want to know the answers to questions. And again, crowdsourced information. And it's called citizen science. And you probably come across citizen science in other ways, like the RSPB do citizen science work by asking you to count butterflies or specific kind of birds. Now, what normally happens is a group of researchers or established academics will go to the public and say, this is our question, please find out the answer, and give us the data, we'll analyse it, we'll decide what to do next. The difference is here that it's parents asking the question, it's parents doing the research, it's parents going through the hellish time of sorting out ethics, and it's parents who are working with the scientists for a change, and so we're a bit of a collaborative team. We are also the parents who analyse the data, and as we can see today, the parents who decide what we do with the data. And the second question that popped up was, what is in the contents of milk? And unlike nappies, it's not really it's something that people can do, but actually breastfeeding is something that a lot of people do naturally, but we don't really have data to back it up. A lot of us breastfeed for more than 6 weeks or more than 6 months, more than a year, and we're told, oh, there's nothing in there, you don't need to. I mean, if you stop formula at 1, you should probably stop breastfeeding at 1 because obviously they don't need it. And the question was asked, what's in milk? What's in milk over 1-year-old? At the same time, there are also a lot of other parents asking other questions. Things like, what support did we get for breastfeeding? From healthcare professionals, from lactation consultants, down to playgroup leaders, to our health visitors, to people we see to talk about babies and children and infant feeding. There was another question that was about how our baby carriers, like how hot does a baby get in a baby carrier? And they did some research about, well, should the current advice of a baby wearing 1 fewer layer than the parent, is that up to date? Is that evidence-based? Turns out, yes, it is. It's fine. And then in the second year, we started getting a little bit further. This isn't a year, by the way, to do one project. It has been about 4 years. I think we're in a 4th year now. But the second year of finding out stuff, we also looked at these healthcare experiences. How do healthcare professionals behave with breastfeeding parents before and after they've breastfed themselves? What does their advice, how does their advice and information support vary? There's Mealtime Hostage, they've got some leaflets downstairs, there's Big Berthas, which is an existing group, so we worked with Big Berthas to do a little bit more data, and they did some qualitative research to find out about that. Let Toys Be Toys, again, is another campaign that already exists, and Parenting Science Gang teamed up with that to find out more information, really. So, the really exciting one, and the one that I was mostly involved with, I came in on Facebook, and I think it was on breastfeeding older babies and beyond, which a lot of us are, I think, and there's 28,000 parents, I think, in that group, something insane like that, and everyone wants to know, why do you carry on breastfeeding? And so we decided, well, let's look into it. So we had around 4,000 parents on the Facebook group. Of course, not everyone can get to London, where we're working with Imperial College to actually give milk samples. So we started off getting as many parents involved who could just give a little bit of their time, often at 11 o'clock at night, kind of on their phone with the twilight setting on your phone. It's all dim, and you can do a little bit while your child is feeding or asleep. And we managed to get 132 of those mothers to London, self-funded, because we have funding from Wellcome to do like Facebook campaigns and to the admin stuff that gets needed. But actually we didn't have anything to give to the parents. So 132 people, self-funded, to come down from wherever they were in the country to donate milk. And we worked with Imperial College, and so Simon Cameron and Natalie Schenker, who some of you probably know from Hearts Milk Bank, to try and put together this study with us doing the ethics and us doing the systematic bit. And then Simon came and joined us, along with 12 peer supporters, 137 children packed into Imperial College's buildings, which was a little bit insane, particularly because the students were doing exams at the same time. And it was a bit mad. We had people from Imperial College coming to support us because loads of them had never seen parent research before. I mean, most of us don't really get to do this. We don't often get to answer the questions we really want to find out. And we had 117 successful donations, and I'll come to that in a sec. So this is a very example of very happy parents, because obviously you can see the varying ranges of milk that each of them managed to get. So some of them, like Serena, she'd been breastfeeding for a long time, so she was able to get like 30 mils out or something only. And some people were getting like 100 mils out in minutes. And the lights, like magic. Okay. Oh, you're leaning on it. Anyone know how to sort the lights out again? Hopefully, Joe. Okay, so what we did with the study, we went to try and get this set up. So we've got a control group of 6-month-olds, 6 to 12 months old. That's fine. And then we tried to get the next set of age brackets, so 1 to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, 3 to 4 years, 5 years, and trying to work out, can we get people here? We decided we'd look at method of expression because we don't know. There's never been checked. What's the best way to take your milk out of your breast if it's not by a child? And again, this is what we could check. So we're going to look at how much milk we could get, what was the fat content, REAMS, which is a mass spectrometer, which is where the sciencey bit came in that we couldn't do, and the microbiome analysis. This is all preliminary stuff, so we've got more to do. So, out of them, we had only 6 people over 40, or children over 48 months, but we had absolutely 19, 16, 17 of this central age bracket where probably most of us breastfeeding people who carry on for longer. That's probably the go between 1 and 3 years old-ish. And the volume of milk. Now, probably people realise if you don't express for a lot of time, you get less and less out. So unless people were actually directly expressing a lot constantly, they really struggled to get some more milk out. And as you can see, the 4-year-old group, it was much less milk than people who had much younger children. And that was a bit of a trial. We didn't think about the fact that, oh, actually, maybe if you've been doing this for a long time, we can't get enough milk. I think we needed 3 millilitres to do some work on it. And not everyone. That's why we had 132 women come down, but 117 donations. So not all of it was usable, unfortunately. And the other important point, where is it here? Tandem feeders. Turns out that we were a really big group. People who were interested in this, probably because there were that many of us who've been doing it for longer and then adding more into it. Cool, thanks. Okay, so the next bit, there we go, was about the fat content. The fat content was pretty consistent. So we know that that children adjust the milk gradually over time, or they may become slightly more efficient feeders. But we also worked out that there are outliers, obviously, and everything. But what we found for our sample group was that it was fairly consistent. There's a fairly simple range bracket, and we want to check more of it. The extra bit, this is from Reams. So Reams is rapid evaporating ionizing and mass spectrometer. Basically what you do, or they did, was put the milk into a special machine. It heats up really fast, and then they measured the smoke that came off what they were burning. And that is about as much understanding of science as I have there. And what they were looking for was, I wrote this down, proteins, lipids, and metabolites. So lipids being fat, and the metabolites are, the things that you need, the energy for making it and for using it. So what we had to look at was what was the crossover. And for all the different age brackets, we had one really cool outlier on the side, but actually there was no crossover between the contents that Reams could see and formula, which it wasn't meant to be a comparison about what's in breast milk, what's in formula. It was more of a, what can we see? Is there any crossover between different contents? And that was not come through. We're just going to look at this one instead. So this is, again, Reams, the mass spectrometer. What we wanted to find out was each one of those blue dots was a different compound that was found in the breast milk. Most of those we don't know what on earth it is. We've got no idea. And this is another thing that we need to do, get more work on, to find out what it is, find out what difference it has, and also find out what variation it has. Because often, in whatever age range there was, these different compounds were found in all of the milk samples, but the levels varied. So although, for example, fat content didn't vary hugely, we know it varies. So it's a little snapshot of one person, one donation, one time. So nothing we can take was particularly definite yet. Again, method of expression. We wanted to check that there is no advantage to hand expressing or using a pump, because I think people often hear things like, oh, you need to keep pumping until you get to the hind milk, or you need to shake the bottle to make sure that nothing separates. And they actually did a check on that, which isn't on here, but they did have a quick look and say, well, is there a difference between glass or plastic or metal bottles? And there wasn't any shaking. They just worked it out. But I think we had glass bottles, plastic bottles, didn't we, for the different sizes to make sure that everything was the same. And hand expression, electric pump, those heroes that were able to express 100 mils by hand and just got on, cracked on with it. Amazing and super inspiring, because one person actually went off and trained to teach hand expression after seeing other people do it, which is great. And with Reams, there was no massive difference from the contents that they found. What was the biggest thing I think that came from this was actually the storage. And we know that you can put milk into the fridge and you can add on to it and then you freeze it. But what we actually found was that milk that went straight into the freezer had less compound changes and less content change over time if you put it in the freezer quicker. So if you had it in the fridge for 4 days and then froze it, there was more content change over that time than if you put it you'd express it and put it straight in the freezer. It's not massive, it's still hugely beneficial, there's still tons of stuff in it, but there was a slight deterioration. I guess the same way that you pick your peas from the harvest, you go from harvest to freezing in an hour and a half. It's kind of the same. But what they did find was that it doesn't massively make a difference if it's -20 or -80. The cost involved in trying to make something like a milk bank freeze at -80, obviously most people don't have a -80 freezer at home. I don't think I do, and ice cream would be really cold. And it doesn't really make a massive difference. So actually, people, if you can freeze it at -20 in your freezer, that's ace. This was part of the milk bank's own checking, because obviously Hearts Milk Bank, they're a milk donation group, and a lot of this will be used to help them and make their decisions as well about how they store their own milk donations. It doesn't make a massive difference, which is quite nice. And then we got to the interesting bit. Everyone's saying there's tons of antibodies in breast milk. We couldn't check that. This machine that we had doesn't check antibodies. So parents were like, really? Really? The whole point of us feeding after one is everyone tells us at least there's antibodies, even if it is water. But we couldn't check it because the machines we have accessible didn't look at it, but it did look at the microbiome. And the bacteria, again, doesn't seem to vary massively. In the tandem feeders, we had obviously more samples, so we could put more dots on. But microbiome, again, no huge variation. Method of hand expressing and so on, it looks huge, but actually there's a fairly neat line across the middle. So variation by individual, but not hugely over expression method or over the age group. So that was that bit. This is a slide that you are allowed to tweet and share widely to garner interest if you wish. And so this is what we learned from our first set of data that was coming back. Breast milk doesn't change to water. We know there is fat in milk after the age of 1. We know that the microbiome, there's bacteria in it after the age of 1. We know that there are other proteins. We know that there is actually some nutritional content in there. What we're trying to work on is how much more is there? How much more data can we gather? What we do see, as I said, there is a variation in levels, but probably not content. So there's more samples expected. Storage has an effect. So if you want to, it is important to you, freeze straight from expressing, it's not going to make a massive difference overall. And the next bit, which is the exciting bit for most of us, is that the results are being published by the 2 scientists that we work with here in college. They are currently in the process of submitting 4 journal articles about the differences between tandem feeders, about storage. That's going to a food freezing magazine. I didn't even know there was one. And it's going to be quite interesting comparing the food freezing techniques with breast milk, but we'll see how it goes. And they've got another one on the microbiome. So those are hopefully going to be published in the next, hopefully 3 or 4 months, but we'll see. So that was the biggest. I think that's probably our most labour-intensive, people involved, spent a lot of time on for the milk study. And then there was another study going on in the second year, which Rachel is going to talk about. And we're just going to do the awkward microphone pass over. Give us a sec. There you go.
I'll try not to throw this on the floor.
Oh, no, don't throw it on the floor. Alex. There you go. And there's your clicker.
Thank you.
So while Rachel talks, we're going to throw milk cards at you gently.
So the Breastfeeding and Healthcare Experiences group actually kind of came out of the other breastfeeding groups within Parenting Science Gang because there were quite a lot of people who were interested in kind of how the advice and support or lack of you get through the healthcare system impacts on breastfeeding. So the group itself was made up of 440 of us. About half of them were either healthcare professionals or peer supporters or both. But it was kind of open to anyone who was interested in getting involved in the research that we did. And we did 2 different studies. So I'm going to talk about the first one. So what we wanted to know, we wanted to gather stories from mothers about their experiences of breastfeeding and the healthcare support that they got. So we got over 750 survey responses. To keep it relevant, we specifically asked for them to be within the UK and in the last 5 years. And we did that so that we can present this to the NHS and say, this is you. So we know, like, we did have to discount a few stories where we weren't entirely certain that they fell within that category. But we wanted to say, this isn't stories from years ago, this isn't, you know, back in the day, whatever happened. And it's in the UK, this is what the NHS is doing now and the impact that it's having. And what we asked for was just anyone who wanted to breastfeed. So it wasn't you had to have been successful, you didn't have to have breastfed your child for any period of time. And actually, we were just as interested in the stories of the people who wanted to breastfeed and for whatever reason weren't able to meet those goals as we were the people who were successful. And so the mothers were invited to share their experiences of healthcare professionals, lactation consultants, breastfeeding supporters, so peer supporters. And it was just a free text box which literally said, like, tell us your story. And then we did some corpus linguistics analysis, which I'll explain a little bit more about. And our collaborator for this was Dr. Gavin Brooks at Lancaster University. So there were 2 elements of what we asked. So the first bit was we did ask some quantitative questions, and they were just basic questions like, who was the most important healthcare professional for you? How many different healthcare professionals were involved? And that we tried to take into account, like, the full range. So it included things like dietitians, nurses, midwives, health visitors, GPs, specialist doctors, and then peer supporters and the as much of a range as we could kind of think of. And then the qualitative part was this free text box, and they were just free to tell us about any aspect of feeding and support that they'd experienced. So there was no limit put on it. We just said, tell us your story. And the range of things that people told us really varied depending on the experiences that they'd had. But basically it gave them an opportunity to tell us what did they think was important within their breastfeeding journey. And then the analysis of the qualitative data was the bit that we did. So there was a small group of us who spent quite a lot of nights reading these stories. And what we did, we broke it down into themes. So there were 3 kind of theme areas that we looked at. So the first one was staff members, and that included midwives, health visitors, doctors and GPs, nurses, peer supporters. And then we also did have a look at IBCLC and lactation consultants, but it was quite difficult because a lot of people use the term lactation consultant, and it's really hard to tell whether they actually mean that the peer supporter came in or whether it was an IBCLC. And a few people specified that it was IBCLC, and that was fine, but actually it was really hard to know what people were using that term for. And then within the issues that we looked at, again, this was one of these examples of kind of crowdsourcing within the group. And so we literally just had a post on our Facebook group that said, we need to think of some issues to look into. Give us some words to search for within this data. So this is what Gavin did before we got it. And the issues that we picked out, and what we did was we had categories, so like allergies, but we were looking for all of the words that might relate to that. So we had allergy, allergies, allergens, CMPA, and just tried to kind of capture all of those things. So we had allergies, aversion, bleeding nipples, blockages, cluster feeding, colic, crying, expressing intervals, formula fussing, hours, hunger, latching, supply, baby size, big baby, small baby, tiny baby, massive baby, mastitis, neonatal, nipples and nipple shields, pain, positioning, depression, reflux, supplementary feeding, thrush, tongue tie, and weight. And some of them there were just a few that fell into that category, and then there were others where it was huge. So like weight got mentioned something like 700 times within our stories. Tongue tie got a lot of mentions. Pain was a huge one, unfortunately. And then the final theme was medications, and we were just trying to find out, because anecdotally a lot of people have said that they've been told that they can't breastfeed on certain medications, they need to stop, they need to pump and dump, that kind of thing. And so we just wanted to try and gather some data on that. And the common things that we looked at in that were antibiotics, anaesthetics, painkillers, ibuprofen, contrast, codeine and antidepressants. So what we got out of this, the sort of themes that came through in our analysis in the issues, is that the early days are really important. I don't think we need to tell you guys this, but it was so easy for people's breastfeeding journeys to be undermined while they were still in hospital within the first 24 hours of giving birth. And a lot of the time it was throwaway comments, and it's the sort of things that probably the people who made those comments wouldn't even remember 2 minutes later that had been something that they said. But we really found that those kind of comments could make or break breastfeeding for a lot of mums, and particularly if people were struggling and then someone made a comment about, oh my goodness, feed that baby, it looks like he's starving. And then you're already in quite a fragile place within that period immediately after giving birth, and then someone tells you that you're starving your baby, and they'll mean it in a kind of supportive, or not, it's not intended to be negative, but it can be absolutely crushing for someone who's sleep deprived, just been through possibly the most emotionally traumatic experience of their entire life, even if it was a good birth, and then they're struggling to feed their baby, and then someone says their baby's starving, and that was probably the biggest thing that I noticed from reading the stories, was just how it was the little things that people said that stuck with a lot of these parents. Another thing was just lack of time for staff was a major factor. So often people would say they were struggling with feeding, and on night shift the staff would go, just give them a bottle, I don't have time to help you right now. And that kind of thing just really obviously undermines things. One of the things that really came up a lot was that tongue tie is commonly missed or downplayed. And I know when we were discussing between the analysts during the work that we were doing, it got to the point where you would read a story and you could see what was coming from the story, and you knew that at some point they were going to say, and then we discovered that my baby had a tongue tie. And of course it's easy retrospectively to read the story and go, yes, on day 1 this happened, on day 5 this happened, 3 weeks down the line this was happening, and these are all of the things that we were struggling with. But actually none of us are, trained to any level in breastfeeding support, and you could see the way that it was heading, and a lot of the time it was just that actually the staff, either it didn't occur to them, or they just didn't have the time to do it, or they weren't putting the bits together. And the other thing was problematic latches and effective transfer of milk were often an issue, but all they worried about was the fact that the baby was losing weight. So nobody at any point said, let's check what's going on with feeding. They just said, the baby needs more milk, have formula, you need to give them top-ups, or if you don't want to give formula, then you need to be expressing and giving top-ups. But they never actually looked at why they weren't getting enough milk in the first place. And often it was things like tongue tie or something underlying, but they would treat the weight loss, or they would deal with thrush or mastitis or nipple damage. But I mean, it's amazing how many people were on the original version of our posters we had. They told me the latch looked fine, because we read that so many times, and it was amazing how many people would say, I was crying in pain, my nipples were in shreds, someone came and looked at a feed and they told me the latch looked fine. And it's like, well, clearly it's not. But that was missed so much, just the kind of realising that there was an underlying problem there. Your nipples don't fall apart spontaneously during this process, or at least we all hope not. In terms of things that worked, because I know I've kind of focused on the negatives, but actually there were some amazingly positive outcomes to these stories, and people that made a big difference. And the most important thing that we found was just people who listened. And often there were lots of little kind of undermining things that happened. But when there was somebody who did something good, what they did was that one person took the time to talk to the mum, say, what's going on, get the entire story, listen to what the mum wanted. Because, I mean, occasionally we would have stories where the mums were like, all I wanted was for someone to say it's okay for you to stop. And actually, if that's what the mother wants, that's okay. But don't tell her to stop when she wants to continue. Listen to what the mother wants. And what we found was often one person was the person that made the relationship, and it was listening. It was having a bit of time to go through it all, often just dealing with things step by step and knowing how to help them. And when healthcare professionals listened carefully to what mothers wanted and needed before offering advice, it made a huge difference. And then the other thing was just having professionals who actually admitted that they didn't always know the answers, and rather than just making something up or giving something from their own experience, they would say, I don't know the answer, I'll go away and find out, and then actually coming back and doing that. But there were a lot of, in the negative side, there were a lot of kind of, well, I only fed my baby for 3 months and it was fine, so it doesn't matter if you don't kind of comments. And it's important that if you don't know, find out, rather than just making something up. So I think you probably all have these now. These are our wonderful little cards. I say wonderful. We put these together as part of our dissemination, and they are intended for healthcare professionals to help in supporting mothers. It's just a little aid memoir, basically, coming up from the things that we got from these stories, and just what needs to be done as a very, very brief summary. And then on the back we've got useful links, and obviously the medication is a really big one that a lot of professionals seem to miss. And so we thought it was important to have those links, and then there's some space for people to put their local support groups on as well. And that's that part. So I am now going to move on to Danny.
Forward one.
That one.
Okay. Yeah. Hello. Oh, that's quite loud, sorry. I'm Danny. I took part in all of the studies, I think, except mealtime hostages. All of the breastfeeding studies I took part in, but I was extra special in I was part of a group that took part in the analysis of mothers' experiences of healthcare professionals. But then we found that within our group of 750 mums and stuff, there was some of us that were healthcare professionals as well as feeding mothers. And so we kind of went, actually, I knew nothing about breastfeeding before I started breastfeeding. I've learned as I've gone on, and now I've had my second child, I know even more. But I probably didn't give the best advice before I started breastfeeding, and I didn't have any training. So at the time I was doing this, I took part in this study where 8 healthcare professionals did informal, semi-structured interviews with each other. So we introduced our jobs and we knew our first names, but we tried to keep it confidential in the fact that we knew that people might actually say, I gave terrible advice. I might have actually done something wrong in my job because I didn't know any better. But I didn't know anything about it before I had to do it myself. And we talked, and we just had massive long discussions. It was supposed to be an hour that we talked about these questions, and I think I talked to my partner for about 3 hours. I don't think all of it got transcribed, but they basically transcribed and looked at what we felt as healthcare professionals before and after we'd breastfed ourselves. And I know, talking to some of my other colleagues that have breastfed as well, that it was fairly normal to feel this way, because healthcare professionals don't get any training on breastfeeding. So as an A&E nurse, I'd never learnt about breastfeeding at all, nothing about it. And before I breastfed, I thought that, you know, before they could kind of sit up and crawl and talk and get teeth was probably about my limit. And then after breastfeeding till 2, I was kind of like, well, why not? Why would I give up at this point at 6 months or so? But I'd never really thought about how that impacts all the breastfeeding mums that come through my A&E. So I'd never thought about when I'm admitting them to wards, and all of a sudden we're saying, you can't take your baby with you, you're being admitted. Who will look after the child? And the mum's like, well, you know, just give it a bottle, it can stay at home with dad. And we're like, well, it's never had a bottle before, you know. We were admitting anyone over the age of 6 weeks with their child wasn't allowed to be admitted with their baby. Under 6 weeks, we could just about get away with admitting a mum to the postnatal ward. But if it was a problem with the mum, then that was often argued as well and not very on board. But it was just, we know there's a lack of training out there. It was just the whole sense that we became breastfeeding advocates in our jobs once we became breastfeeding mothers. So we went back to work and we were maybe having to discuss with our colleagues about the fact we were pumping. And then the whole issue about the NHS is terrible at supporting mothers return to work, never mind pumping mothers to work. I had to talk to my manager about where my milk might be stored. I was like, just the food fridge, I'll just put it in a bag, it'll be fine. Never mind the fact that I think someone actually tampered with my milk one day at work. Don't know if they tried it, but they definitely had a look at it. But it was a very small study, and we know it has its limitations, but obviously there was the reoccurring themes that came out over and over again. And, you know, being surprised that people are still feeding their baby or feeding in front of each other because you don't see it anywhere, never mind in your place of work. And then, not knowing where to look for help or knowing that help's needed for certain things. So doctors, I think, in their training maybe have an hour on breastfeeding. A lot of that would be around mastitis. And the fact that women do breastfeed, not about how it actually works or what other things can impact on it, or, you know, what to do if there's a problem, like how to, you know, who you would refer to. I'd not heard of a lactation consultant before I started breastfeeding and looking at problems myself. So I didn't know it existed as a healthcare professional. Pumping and dumping just shouldn't exist, but you don't know that. As a doctor, you get a little leaflet in the drug thing, or you look in the BNF, which is a book that they'll live by. I've had discussions with doctors recently that they won't look at LactMed because it's American. They'll only look at the British National Formulary because it's the book they use, that's their Bible for prescribing. It has zero information about using drugs in pregnancy and breastfeeding other than avoid. And you're like, okay. And in the back, there's a little tiny section on it for some drugs like paracetamol, which they assume would be okay now because we've used it for centuries. Although someone told me recently, paracetamol wouldn't actually get through licensing laws now because we have no idea how it works in the body. So it wouldn't be licensed for anybody, never mind pregnant and breastfeeding people. But it's that kind of level of misunderstanding with drugs that causes lots of problems, and the doctors will always err on the side of caution when prescribing. So they will say, oh, I'm not sure if you can take this with breastfeeding, which the mum will take to mean don't. And it's just, it's disheartening to hear this happens across the board with every healthcare professional. And you just think of how many missed opportunities there are out there and how many times we're influencing people's feeding habits because they trust us as healthcare professionals to actually know what we're talking about. And actually, a lot of the time, we would give our own experiences as advice. And we need to move away from that and have more evidence-based advice to be able to give them. Or, like we said, go and find someone who does know. If you're a GP who's got a woman with an abscess and you're like, oh, you can't feed, is there a way that maybe she could still express from that side or do something else? Is there someone who knows a bit more about it? I've had to question doctors when I've been treated as a patient, but it's only because I knew that I could question them on it that I did. And as a mum who doesn't know to question, that they don't know anything. You would just take everything they tell you at face value. And it's hard as a healthcare professional to admit that you've done wrong because you just didn't know. But ignorance isn't really an excuse. And yeah, it's hard to take part in the study and talk about what we've probably failed at, but interesting, and shows that a lot more needs to be done with healthcare professionals, which is why we come out and disseminate it. But all the times we've disseminated so far, I've been to like breastfeeding friendly groups, like you say, an echo chamber. Everyone here goes, yeah, I've heard that too. But we're trying to sneak it out to people that maybe don't know about us and about breastfeeding so much. So it's trying to find people that need the advice almost, is where we're heading next, I think. But yeah, I had a couple of chats with colleagues about breastfeeding my toddler and why I was still expressing at work when she was over 1. Mainly because I had an oversupply issue and I couldn't get through a 12-hour shift without expressing, but that was another issue. But yeah, lots of my nurse colleagues were like, oh, you're still feeding. Why? I'm like, can't imagine doing anything else. She falls over and hurts herself. What am I going to do? That's my parenting. That's it, 101. But yeah, it was strange to hear conversations with staff. But being an openly breastfeeding mum in my place of work, actually opened conversations and dialogues with other people. But I did have a doctor colleague who struggled to even get breaks to express. And her babe was 8 months when she returned to work. I was lucky to be 13 months. And I was trying to say to her, they legally have to give you these breaks. And she's like, yeah, but my colleagues complain that I'm off the shop floor and I'm not doing as much work, because she had to go and express. And I think her feeding was shorter than she wanted it to be, which is unfortunate because you think we should be advocating for our own colleagues as well. But it's hard. I think all of us said that it was an issue actually expressing or thinking about going back to work and worrying about going back to work. And as a healthcare professional, should we be worried about how our colleagues are going to feel about breastfeeding when, but then we had those judgments before we breastfed ourselves. So how did we make our colleagues feel previously to becoming mothers? Yes, I don't think you should really feel like it's as bad as smoking. But yeah, having extra breaks is seen as slacking in the NHS. So we don't think that every healthcare professional that talks to mums about breastfeeding should have children and be breastfeeding themselves or have that experience. But, I mean, it'd be lovely. The issue is that not knowing anything means that you have no idea that you don't know anything. At least if we get some information out there that people are realising that there's more information, there's more things they need to know, that then they'll go and look for more information themselves and know who to contact. But yeah. We know that we all become like massive breastfeeding advocates at work and we're like, oh no, they can definitely do that. Let me look it up on this. I do that a lot with contrast CTs, but yeah. Yeah, baby changing tables don't work as well. You realise when you become a parent that there's just accessibility for people in your workplace is terrible as well. But that was me. That was my chat about being a healthcare professional and breastfeeding, and I think we're out of time. No? I've got time, but if anyone had questions.
Yeah, so...
Do you want the doodah back since
yes,
you're talking?
yeah.
Shall I just stand next to you?
Yeah, I can just clip. Just going to be friendly now because I can't bother to do the whole microphone thing. So that's our preliminary set of data for the 3 different studies that we've been involved in out of the 8. So we've talked about the ones that we're involved with, and this has been quite an interesting process because obviously we don't normally get to answer the questions that we have via Facebook with some evidence. It's quite nice. And what we would like, our plan for today was part of our funding plan. So we got funding from Wellcome to do the studies, to get some, to pay for some of the stands and attending events. And our funding finishes at the end of December. So because we only have preliminary data and we haven't reached publication stage yet, we are doing a lot of volunteer work at 11 o'clock at night or 2 o'clock in the morning, or maybe on your little lunch break if you're lucky, and trying to get more information out. So what we would really like is if people say, you know what, actually, those cards could do with a little bit of this information on it, or we need that poster, the posters we've got on our store downstairs. We need people to say to us, we need that there, or actually this doesn't work for us for our type of our field. Could you please give it to us in this format or in that format? But what we're hoping to do is anyone who is interested is sign up for the information emails, and then when we finally get published through the various studies, we're going to send it out, because the best thing we can do to combat misinformation is provide evidence against it, right? We can trust ourselves and we can turn around and say, you know what, yes, I'm feeding my 18-month-old, yes, I'm feeding my 3-year-old, yes, I'm feeding my 7-year-old. So what? What's nice is that we can come back and say, yeah, and now the evidence backs us up. So deal with it. So after the Parenting Science Gang funding finishes, we are sort of midway converting to a group called Parents Do Science, because we are scientists and parents, whatever your title or background, or whether you're nurses or academics or arty people like me who have no science background. And we would just really like people to tell us if there's anything they could do or they would need to get the information out there quickly, efficiently, and so that we can provide other parents with information, because everyone in this room is placed in a great way to get information to others in casual formats or by work email. So we've got a few minutes, like 10 minutes, it's 1:15, we've got about 10 minutes if anyone has any questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. So anyone got questions about the data or the methodology, or questions you would like yourselves answering? Yeah.
Just what you were saying about being a nurse and like knowing about breastfeeding. I'm a midwife, and I kind of accepted going into pregnancy, and I think that you're not going to get the outcome you want. Like the birth I wanted a water birth, I had forceps and theatre and MOH, and like I had proper midwife birth and everything. The one thing I thought going in was, I know how to breastfeed, I know how to get a baby to breastfeed, I'll be fine. And actually I had everything going, and it was really hard, and it's 100% true you don't know what you don't know. And I actually, sorry if midwives hate me for saying this, but I don't think midwives know how to teach how to breastfeed.
No, the World Breastfeeding, the WBTI have done I assume most people have seen it, but the WBTI have done a spreadsheet based on how much time different healthcare professionals have learning about breastfeeding. And understandably, GPs have the least, because they've got a billion other things they need to learn about. The whole point of general practice, they have to learn stuff. But I think they have one seminar in 7 years on breastfeeding and infant feeding, and that just isn't enough. But how do we get things out to them? That's the process.
The thing is, I don't think they value the importance of breast milk.
No.
Based on my experiences with, sorry, I'm not live, but it was sad for me that I knew what to ask for and who to ask for in order to get where I am today. And I've got a friend that's going through a very similar experience who didn't have that and is in a very different avenue to me.
Yeah, support is essential.
But
informed.
Going home and reading my notes, because that's the kind of person I am, the arguments that the infant feeding coordinator had with the paediatricians based on my care, you think that paediatricians and GPs are primary caregivers to these babies, yet they don't value the importance of breast milk. And that's kind of, as far as I'm concerned, fundamental to everything.
Yes, I suppose that's why.
I think that was part of the value of the healthcare professionals' interviews with each other. While it's a very small study, I think it kind of mirrors the experience of a lot of healthcare professionals, where they've gone into it going, yeah, I know about this stuff because I've done whatever before. But actually, the lived experience really does add an extra dimension to it. And it's really hard to get this out there to the people who haven't lived that experience yet. And I am a medical student, so I understand where these people come from. And I'm in the 4th year of my medical degree, and I am already so frustrated by the conversations that I have with my fellow students, with some of the people who are teaching us. I mean, we did a whole women's health rotation, and we didn't cover breastfeeding in it at all. And I asked the lead midwife who was teaching us why we didn't cover breastfeeding, and she said it's not in the learning outcomes.
There's no need to learn about it. I mean, why would you need to learn
So
about breastfeeding?
the university doesn't say you need to know about it now,
Yeah.
so we're not going to bother teaching you.
What were you had your question,
I was
Liv?
going to kind of add that sort of, that obviously a lot of the healthcare professionals, like sort of the GPs and pediatrician, they see the extreme cases when it really went wrong.
Yes.
So for them, it's very difficult to actually understand what is normal and what is fine and what it should be. And because of that, sort of, sometimes they have kind of completely skewed view of what it looks like.
It's hard to know what normal is when you don't get to see it often.
And also because of their own experience, sort of, they are every time sort of, with somebody sort of, every time they kind of sort of, they feed their baby, they're anticipating what's going to go wrong. And sort of, all the sort of, symptoms they are looking, they are not there, they're absolutely normal behavior, but they are seeing things that are not there because of their knowledge.
They don't deal with normality because
No one complains
you're
about
normal, you
normality.
don't need a doctor. Nothing like that.
The other issue is paperwork. There's a lot of tick boxes, and breastfeeding doesn't fit into those tick boxes. I work in a pediatric unit, and we get a lot. You've got the fluid balance. We have to work out every child comes in has to work out the maintenance. How much do they need it? What is the point of working out the maintenance of a breastfed baby? It's not gonna. It's just not gonna make any.
It takes time.
1,000 mils. This is baby needs 1,000 mils, but they've not had any. I'm like, well, they have. They've had 10 breastfeeds, so no.
Maybe we could weigh mum before and after feeds. Weigh babies before and after. Yeah. Yeah. Has to be naked.
It doesn't appeal.
No
Yeah.
one's going to like that.
So that's most of it then. Oh, sorry, you have a. I can.
They still do.
Yeah.
They get a lot of input into the NHS from formula companies, unfortunately. Their CPD study days are often supported by formula companies who say, we don't influence their choices, but all their posters and leaflets have their
the
type
brand,
of formula at the bottom. It's always slightly there, never overtly said to the doctors that this is the one to use, but we know from experience in talking to mums that they will be told to use a certain formula.
Yeah. We went to present at the all-party parliamentary group down in London for the infant feeding meeting, which a few people actually were here too. And we were talking about it, and they were talking about it for the dispatches programme. And it's just, it's fine. We didn't ever go out to this to compare formula and breastfeeding, because it's just more data about arguing about with people, and it's a very emotive topic. We didn't need to do that though. We just wanted to be able to say, hey, you want to breastfeed? Fantastic. Here's some information for you. Rather than, hey, you want to breastfeed? We don't know anything about supporting that, so you're on your own. Thank God for Facebook. So I think it's our time. So thank you very much. Stop. Need to turn you off.
Okay, so we've got one more talk at half.
Now, so now you're live. There you are. You're ready to go.
Perfect.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, welcome to our final talk of the festival. It makes me quite sad to say that. So, Lindsay Hookway is an IBTLC. She works privately, but also voluntarily within the NHS. So she's kind of got all bases covered in terms of her situation with breastfeeding mums. She also is a holistic sleep coach. This is her book, which if you haven't got it already, it's available downstairs after her talk. And just a final reminder, please, at the end, if you can hand us your feedback forms, that would be massively helpful. Not that I'm saying to do them during Lindsay's speaking, but otherwise, please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The irony of closing a really busy 2-day weekend with a talk on sleep is never lost on me. This is about the 3rd time it's happened this year, so I'm hoping that I'll be interesting enough to keep you all awake. That's my #1 aim, so I hope you find this useful. I have the usual kind of disclosures. I've written a book, I run a course, nothing non-code compliant, so nobody needs to get too bent out of shape, hopefully, about that. So today I want to cover a little bit about some of the normal behaviours that we see in the night, about night feeding, about night waking. I want to try and help us think about separating night feeding and night waking, because that's a really common thing that people mush them together. I would like to very briefly talk about some of the benefits of night waking. For an exhausted person, it doesn't ever feel like there are any benefits, but there really are, and we'll cover them briefly. And I'll also talk you through when night waking and night feeding might be problematic for a particular family for a particular reason, and what some of the things that we can do to support that gently might be. Okay, so you probably know this. There are lots of benefits. Night waking is not a design fault. We actually are designed to wake frequently at night. Of course, all of us wake frequently all through the night, and in different cultures, people have different patterns of waking. So if you talk to somebody from certain parts of Europe, actually a really long siesta is normal, and then a much later bedtime than previously considered normal in our sort of Western-centric idea of sleep. And actually, if you speak to people from the African continent, parts of Asia, and parts of the Caribbean, frequent napping throughout the day is really normal, and more fragmented sleep at night. But in terms of waking up in the night time, we know that all babies do this. We know that it reduces the risk of SIDS. And one of the things that we really need to not ignore is the fact that breastfed babies not only wake up more in the first 4 months, but they also have a reduced risk of SIDS, right at that time when SIDS is the highest risk, between 2 and 4 months. So it's not a design fault, it's not an accident that breastfed babies do wake up a little bit more frequently at night. Actually, the differences in night waking melt away after about 4 months. So whatever you've heard about breastfed babies waking up more at night long term, it's not true, and I'll come on to a little bit more about that in a little while. And I know this sounds like a no-brainer statement, but when you feed a baby in the night and you respond to them at night, it reduces cry-fuss behaviours. such a shocker, right? Who finds that surprising? But somebody's actually researched it, so it's good to know, right? We can back up our instinct with a paper or two. So what's normal? Okay, and I spend a huge amount of my time talking about normality and reassuring people that their baby's sleep is completely normal. But here we go. 85% of 6 to 18-month-olds wake up 1 to 3 times in the night. I quote this study probably nearly every day of my life. And what you can reverse that, and you can think, well, that means only about 15% of babies, older babies, are actually sleeping through the night. So it's actually really unusual. And we've lost sight of that, haven't we? As a society and as a whole, we think that sleeping through the night is something that generally happens once you hit the magic 6 months. Has anyone here heard that? We'll come on to that later as well. And of course, humans, if you think about this from a mammalian point of view, we are one of the carry mammals. We are designed to carry our babies. Our babies are designed to be in close proximity with us. It's normal, it's beneficial. It is designed to increase attunement and responsiveness. And it is designed to reduce stress in both parents and in babies as well. And that's also not a design fault. Now, we are part of the mammal family. Now, I don't know which picture stands out most for you on this picture. Anyone, any particular animal jump out at you? The seal, right. Not too tricky parenting, a little one who feeds once a week, right? I know a few people who actually would quite like their babies to feed a little less frequently, maybe not once a week. You'd have boobs like watermelons, wouldn't you? But the point is, our mammalian milk is designed to be species specific, right? So actually the feeding frequency of different mammals reflects some of the milk composition of that mammal parent, okay? So if you look at the 3 frequently feeding, or perhaps normally interval feeding mammals on there, we've got 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And what do you notice about the composition of the frequent feeding mammals? Low protein. And what's really high? The lactose. Yeah, and that's fairly common among the frequently feeding mammals. So if you look at the mammals that feed less frequently, in general, they've either got higher fat or higher protein or both, like mama seal. So actually part of this is not something that we can really change. Our milk composition drives the frequency of infant feeding behaviour. And of course there is a little bit of variability, isn't there? People are often trying to compare the fat content of their milk. They might send it off for analysis. Has anyone heard of that? Oh my gosh, we don't need to do that, folks. If babies are thriving, they're fine. But anyway, that's a whole other talk. So what's the difference then between problematic and normal, and how do we define normal, and how do other people think normal sleep looks? This is really difficult because often sleep researchers are coming at this from a completely different angle to people who are trying to optimize and support and promote and protect breastfeeding. So we've got the sleep sort of agenda, which is usually saying things like night feeding after 6 months is not necessary. Right, that's what we hear, isn't it? That's not what I believe, by the way, just getting it out there. We've also got, maybe it's the number of night wakes that's not normal, according to some sleep researchers, all right? But actually there's no consensus. Nobody can quite agree on what constitutes problematic night waking or sleep as a big picture, okay? So I tend to think quite contextually about this. So I want to know what the context is. I want to know why sleep is so problematic for a particular family. What is particularly going on for them? Is it something about their mental health, their physical health? Is it about their social support networks? Is it something to do with some sort of trauma? Is it, I don't know. We need to know that stuff because it might be exacerbating the variation of normal that baby is probably experiencing. Because the truth is most babies have no sleep pathology, right? But what about things like hourly waking in a much older child? Now, some people find that okay, don't they? Because they're bed sharing and their baby just kind of you know, helps themselves to the all-night snack bar, and it's fine, and everybody just kind of sleeps through it. But have you equally met people who are very much disturbed by those frequent night wakes, and they're finding it really problematic, or they feel like they can't feed lying down for whatever reason, they're sitting up to feed? Or what about the people who are bottle feeding and they have to get up and make a bottle? There are some reasons why it might be particularly difficult for some people. And then what about things like restless leg and snoring? If you ever hear of a child snoring or mouth breathing, that's never normal. You always need to send that child up to see the GP, preferably to get some ENT review. It's never normal, except if they've got a cold, obviously. You know, if you're mouth breathing because your nose is blocked, that's understandable. But you always refer a snoring child, okay? But there's no real definition of what is normal and what's problematic. Okay, that's the short version of that. And of course, when we're thinking about, you know, doing something about sleep, it's always going to be a balance between the best interests of the child and the best interests of the parent. And ideally what we want is something that marries the two of those together. We don't want infant mental health and attachment to be collateral damage, do we? Ever. That's certainly not what I'm about anyway. But let's have a think about what people hear. I don't know if it's going to be possible. I'd love you to play with me. I'm mindful it's the end of the day. So play with me if you can. Would you mind all standing up? Would that be okay? If you can. If you're not able to, then don't worry. Of course you can. Yeah. You don't need to. If it's inconvenient or difficult, then don't worry about it. Okay. I would like you to sit down if you've ever been told by a health professional or you've heard that bigger babies sleep through the night earlier. Couple of people. Okay. What about babies sleep through the night when they reach a certain weight? 10 pounds, 12 pounds, 3 months, double their birth weight, 5 kilos. Anyone heard any of this rubbish? What about starting solids? Yeah. Okay. Lots of bums hitting the deck now. You can raise a hand at this point if you've heard something else, and then if you run out of, you can raise 2 hands. Some people will get, it's like sleep bingo. If you've heard all of this stuff, then you get extra points. Okay. What about supplementing with formula? Okay. There we go. Have we got anybody still standing? And I've not even reached the end of my list. Bottle-fed babies will sleep through the night faster, regardless of what's in the bottle, actually. Yeah? So you've all heard this. You've all heard at least one of these myths. They're all rubbish. There's no evidence base behind any of them at all. But what does society say is normal about night waking and night feeding? We generally hear that it will stop at 6 months, right? I don't know why. Why would a baby suddenly stop night waking and feeding at 6 months? Because they've stopped breastfeeding. When you've stuffed them full of banana, maybe. When you've expressed a feed and given it via bottle, because obviously that's going to make them sleep, or whatever. We also hear that it's unnecessary, it's a bad habit, right? That waking up in the night has become a habit, or feeding at night has become a habit. And it doesn't help when we've got advertising, does it, saying that a particular milk is going to be the thing that will make your baby sleep through the night. Good old hip organic. Now, the reason I talk about these myths is because they become urban truths, don't they? They become the sort of sleep scapegoats, I call them. All right? So when people are really struggling with sleep, what generally happens is they will blame something or someone, okay? And often it's something that they're doing a lot of. So they might blame bed sharing. Has anyone heard that bed sharing is the cause of poor sleep, right? Or breastfeeding, or not having any kind of a schedule or a routine. Have you heard that as well? Yeah? Okay. Or just attachment parenting in general, responsive parenting. Making a rod for your own back. It's all of that stuff. It's still perpetuated, unfortunately. And the reason I'm so passionate about this is because when people start to really struggle with sleep, they will blame a scapegoat, and then what do you think they do with that scapegoat? they address it, usually by abandoning it. And sleep can become the reason for cessation of breastfeeding. So the quest for more sleep leads to forced independence between parents and babies. So let's get them in their own room. Let's stop feeding to sleep. Let's teach that baby to self-soothe. Let's get them on a routine. Let's start solids. Let's abandon breastfeeding and try formula. And the problem is, even though it's not evidence-based, and even though it usually doesn't work, people still believe it's true. And the damage has then been done, hasn't it? We've abandoned breastfeeding in the quest for more sleep. So that's why we need to talk about it. And in terms of what information people have, so if a desperate family goes to see a health professional, what information is available to them? Okay, you've probably accessed most of this, I would probably guess. So you might, BASIS, lots of people access BASIS. Really good information. You might have had in-service updates. You might just have learnt on the job, and your experience of learning on the job is going to be dictated by who you've learnt from. You might have learnt from books. There are some great books, there are some not so great books. That's the truth, isn't it? What about BFI? There's some resources on BFI, but they're not terribly practical. It's really good information, really evidence-based, but not massively practical if you're really, really struggling. Other training, there's lots of training around, isn't there? The IHV website, coming back to that. Various guidelines, various pieces of research that people might have accessed or read, and then the Lullaby Trust. So there's a variety of different information that people can get hold of. Now, this is what the Healthy Child Programme evidence update talks about. I won't bore you by reading the whole thing, but I'll just read the bottom bit, okay? So this is the main document that community healthcare practitioners are accessing. There is good evidence from systematic reviews to support the use of behavioural sleep training methods with infants between 4 months and 2 years. So in case you don't know, behavioural sleep training is cry it out and control crying. I won't bore you with things like fading and scheduled awakenings, but we've got those as well. Okay, so that's what our policy documents are saying. Is everybody okay with that? No, I'm not okay with it either. Absolutely not. And you know what? Even if they haven't read that document, and a lot of people haven't, because I think they sort of publish this slightly under the radar without running it past people like BASIS or BFI for that matter. But even if they haven't accessed that, they will probably have read media updates, social media, newspapers. Cry it out's fine, everyone's doing it. It'll be job done, 3 days. Just do it, you're heroic. I was talking to somebody just the other day actually that this really started between the wars. You were seen as a bit of a hero actually if you could tough it out. You know, you could be strong and ignore the sounds of your baby crying. There were lots of political drives to get babies sleeping longer at night because it increased productivity in the daytime. And that it's not a new message, unfortunately. Now, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time looking at some of the articles that they're citing as being good evidence from systematic reviews. I have written about this at length on my blog, which you can all access for free. It's called the Cry It Out Debate, so I won't bore you with it now, but I will just try and summarise, okay? So most of the time when people are saying cry it out and control crying are fine, they are citing either the Hiscox study or the Price or Gradisar study. And basically, the Hiscox study, the first one over here, have I got a pointer or? No, never mind. So this one, this was a study of 328 mother-baby pairs in Australia. It was a very homogeneous sample. And what they did was they randomised children to either have controlled crying or sleep education. And they were looking to see if controlled crying improved sleep and reduced postnatal depression. Okay? And essentially, it moderately improved sleep. It really didn't do an awful lot to the sleep. And they also found that the postnatal depression rates were lower in the controlled crying group. So the main take-home of that study was controlled crying works and it's beneficial for parental mental health. The only problem is all of the parents in the study were seen by a clinical psychologist. Does anyone think that might have improved their mental health? Okay, so then in the background we've got the wonderful Wendy Middlemiss, who did her study looking at what happens to babies' cortisol levels when we do cry it out. So what Wendy did was she measured cortisol levels before the intervention, during the intervention, and then after the babies had fallen asleep. And what she found, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is that the cortisol levels rose for the babies, and then they remained it's late. They remained elevated after the intervention. Okay, so the take home from that was, although the babies had gone to sleep, they fundamentally hadn't self-soothed because they were still stressed. Does that make sense? Good. And then along came the Price study, which sounds like a different study, but actually it was the same researchers as the Hiscox study, and it was actually the follow-up study of the original one. And what they did was they took their original sample of children, unfortunately lost half their sample to follow-up, and actually the children they lost to follow-up were the most high-risk children, so the ones most likely to have been affected by the control crying in the first place. So we'll leave that one there. And what they found was when they checked the cortisol levels at age 6, they were all within the normal range. Only problem is, no one told them that cortisol levels in children rise between 1 month and 12 months of age. Okay, that's normal. And then what happens after 12 months is they decline and they reach their nadir, their low point, at about 6 years. Okay, so what they actually did was they measured the cortisol levels at the time when they would have been lowest anyway. And not only that, we don't have a baseline sample to compare it to. Not only that, but you have a circadian level of cortisol, don't you? Because that helps you to get up in the morning and then feel calmer at bedtime. But you also have a stress response cortisol, right? So your stress response is not circadian linked. So when you're stressed and you're crying, as in the Middlemiss study, you're going to get an elevated cortisol level. Does that make sense? But actually, the cortisol that you release during a stress response has no relationship with your circadian cortisol. So measuring a circadian cortisol level 6 years after the event is irrelevant. Does that make sense? It's completely meaningless information. And then we have the Gradisar study. What they did, they had an even smaller sample of children, I think 46 if I remember rightly. And what they did was they measured cortisol for a few weeks after, but they still only measured the circadian cortisol, not the stress response HPA axis cortisol. So lots of problems, okay? The short version is the studies are rubbish. They're absolutely useless. We have not got enough evidence at the moment to say that cry it out and controlled crying are good evidence and that they're safe. Does that make sense? Oh, are you all with me? Am I among enough friends to say that they're rubbish? It's just total rubbish. Okay, I could go on, but I won't. Read the blog if you're interested. And then, after all that crying, does it even work? Well, Pam Douglas says no. You're probably going to need to repeat it. Because actually children change, don't they? They develop, they move on, they cut a tooth, they learn to crawl. You know, whatever's going to happen, something is going to upset sleep further down the line. And is it accurate? Well, most of the studies so far have compared the sleeping behaviours at night of children that are based on parental report. And Alana Rudzik and Helen Ball's study last year found that actually what was happening was when you compared objective data from sleep actigraph, which is a little device a bit like a Fitbit, and when you compare that data against parental report, what's happening is the formula feeding parents are overestimating their baby's sleep, and the breastfeeding parents are underestimating their baby's sleep. And actually there's not an awful lot of difference between breastfed and formula-fed babies' sleeping patterns. But that's not what the parental report says. So if we've been relying on parental report for decades to tell us what works and what doesn't work at night, anyone else think we need to throw out all the studies and start again? Oh dear. So, what about night feeds? Where does that leave us, apart from scratching our head? Well, if you think about what the prevailing hypotheses are about night feeds and sleep, you probably will have heard of one of these things. You'll probably hear, hands up, it's a sleep association. Anyone heard that one? Yeah? Okay, who's heard that continuing the night feeds will reinforce night waking. Okay, it's like bingo again. What about that the night feed is a reward, right? So actually if we make it water at night, that's less of a reward. They're not going to wake up. I call BS to that. I call BS. I really do. I think babies will either, they're not stupid, they know when they're being given milk or water, right? And they can also develop a habit of drinking water in the night. I've met loads of those babies. So that's not really solved any problems, has it? Or what about reverse cycling in the day? Now that does sometimes happen, doesn't it? So when parents go back to work, have you seen that a little bit? Yeah? Sometimes when babies are very distracted, have you seen that too? So they sometimes will have a 4 or 5 or 6 hour stretch of not feeding in the day, won't they? Because life's just really exciting, and then they make up for it at night. So you do see that a little bit, don't you? But do you also hear from some people that what's happening is because they're feeding all night, that's why they're not eating in the daytime? That's a particular favourite among health professionals, isn't it? Yeah? So the reason your baby is not sleeping well is because they're up all night feeding, and then they're not eating solid food. And that really what you need to be doing is making them not feed at night and then eat plenty of solid food in the day. 3 small meals and 2 snacks. Do you hear that? Right? Yeah, by 8 months. Good luck with that. It often doesn't happen. But what about feeding to sleep specifically? Because that's often the thing that people think is the linchpin of improving sleep, isn't it? Now, the difficulty with this is the evidence is mixed, okay? We cannot ignore the fact that there are a huge number of studies that have found a correlation between feeding to sleep and feeding back to sleep in the night and the maintenance of frequent night waking. Okay? And you see this, don't you, anyway, in practice. We don't need a study of 10,000 people to tell us this, because actually we've seen it, haven't we? However, not only is it true for both breast and bottle-fed babies, so feeding to sleep with a bottle also does this. Breastfeeding is not the thing that's making them do that. It's perhaps it's feeding per se to sleep that is continuing that behaviour. However, it's a biological norm, right? So we have 2 truths. Yes, it probably does mean that babies will wake more frequently at night, but it's also a biological norm. So I end up coming full circle back to my point that most of the time I spend my time talking about how most infant behaviour is completely normal. However, we have to listen to the context, don't we? We have to listen to the lived experience of people and what their particular situation is. But I want to just talk about some of the hormonal influences on night feeding and night sleeping. And hopefully you've all got enough headspace for this. Okay, so I think it often makes sense to parents to understand what's going on. So I hope this makes sense to you. But there are a number of hormones that control both feeding behaviours and hunger and appetite and satiety and sleep induction, all right? The first one is ghrelin, okay? Now ghrelin, I remember ghrelin because I call it ghrelin the growler. This is the tummy rumble hormone, okay? Now what ghrelin does is it's released when your stomach is empty, and it's really clever because your appetite adjusts according to how full your stomach is and also your blood sugar. This is a really clever mechanism, right? If your stomach is empty, having a stomach rumble will trigger you to go and get more food. It's a very sensible survival mechanism, isn't it? And then we have orexin. Now orexin is a really interesting hormone because it promotes wakefulness. It actually makes you feel more alert, and when you're alert, it increases your appetite. Now this makes an enormous amount of sense because when you're awake, you've got a higher metabolic rate, haven't you? More body systems are fully functional, your brain is more active, and you need more fuel to sustain wakefulness. Does that make sense? Right? So actually, orexin is another bodily hormone that we release to make us both awake and hungry. All right? Then we have leptin. Who knows that leptin is in breast milk? I'm sure a lot of you know that. It's a really cool fact. Now, leptin regulates your appetite. It stops you stuffing yourself. It's actually implicated in the reduction of obesity and diabetes, particularly in breastfed babies. And it's one of those unreplicable hormones. We can't put it in formula. Now, what leptin does is it induces that kind of blissed out, chilled, content feeling, doesn't it? Yeah? It makes you feel very sleepy and content, and it decreases your appetite. Then we have cholecystokinin, or CCK for short. Now, CCK also decreases your appetite, and it protects your sleep. And what it also does is it induces deep non-REM sleep. It induces stage 3 sleep. So that makes you feel good. Okay, so that's why when you're breastfeeding a baby, you get that limp limb sign eventually, don't you? Because they've had that induction of non-REM sleep. And then we have brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a right mouthful, I can tell you, usually abbreviated to BDNF, excuse the typo. Now, BDNF induces sleep as well, and it reduces appetite. And get this, it particularly reduces eating for pleasure. What do we often call eating for pleasure? Comfort feeding, right? The thing that we blame babies for being awake all night. But actually, BDNF reduces that drive to comfort feed. Now, where does that leave us when we're not getting perhaps as much sleep as we're used to? Well, ghrelin increases. Okay, so what that's going to do is it's going to increase your appetite. So when you're more tired, you're more hungry. Who can relate? Yeah? Okay, so we know that's true. And we've got tons of research on this because of the obesity problem that we have and the rising obesity rates. So somebody clever, lots of clever people actually, have investigated some of the hormonal differences and implications of sleep loss, and they've found these correlations numerous times. We also get a decrease in leptin. Now, do you remember leptin is the hormone that makes you feel blissed out, content, full? Now, if you've got less leptin, that's going to increase your appetite as well, isn't it? Does that make sense? So when you're more tired, you are more hungry. And you're not only more hungry for certain foods, aren't you? Who knows what? Carbs, fatty foods. Yep, in general. Now, interestingly though, when you're sleep deprived, you also get some hormones that are trying to help you with your sleep. So you get orexin being blocked. Now that's really interesting because what orexin does, do you remember, is it promotes wakefulness and appetite. So your body is constantly trying to find the balance between maintaining sleep and making sure you've got enough calories. Yeah, with me? What do we do with this information when all of this research, though, is based on older children and adults? We're not talking about applying this to babies who are exclusively milk-fed, are we? That doesn't make any sense at all. So how do we interpret it? Well, I would put it to you that, yes, of course, some babies probably do develop a preference for falling asleep in a particular way. That's not really rocket science, is it? Yeah, we all develop habits around how we fall asleep. And if a little one decides that breastfeeding to sleep is the way to go, then that will probably be their favourite way, won't it? And actually, I suspect if you ask most babies, how would you prefer to go to sleep? I suspect most of them would say, I like mummy and booby, please. That would be very nice. But it's possible that we have a little bit of a chicken and egg situation going on. Because don't you agree that if you're sleep deprived and you've got an increase in appetite, and if when you're awake, you get an increased appetite, is it therefore not possible that sometimes children feed in the night because they're awake, not because they're hungry? Does that make sense? So therefore what I'm saying is sometimes babies are probably being fed in the night because they're awake rather than waking up because they're hungry. That's really important because a lot of people will say that when their baby's waking up frequently at night, it's because they haven't got enough milk. So it's really important to address that myth so they don't start thinking that they don't have enough milk and they need to supplement. With me? It's very hot in here, isn't it? Whew, we're doing well. Okay. So the $1 million question does reducing night feeds improve night sleep? Show of hands. Who's been told that yes, it does? That reducing night feeds is what you need to do to improve sleep. Who thinks that it's a little more complicated than that? I'm not going to ask you if it's true or not, because that's not a fair question. There's not very much research on this at all. And what research we do have suggests that when people do reduce night feeds, what we might end up doing is reducing the duration and exclusivity of breastfeeding. So we know that that might happen. But also, are we missing the point, folks? Because if it doesn't actually directly impact night waking, what's the point of removing the easiest, quickest, most reliable way of getting a child back to sleep? Because it works, doesn't it? Right? It's a tool. So this is really difficult, because if people believe that night feeding and night sleeping are inextricably entwined, they believe that stopping one will therefore, by definition, stop the other. And I want to put it to you that they're actually two closely related but completely independent things. Does that make sense? Stopping night feeding will not stop night waking, because night waking is not just about hunger, is it? And we know that sometimes children are feeding in the night because they're awake, not because they're hungry. But sometimes they might be hungry, sometimes they might be thirsty, sometimes it's comfort. And why is comfort feeding considered to be bad, right? So, the other thing, though, that I want to say about this is that sometimes stopping night feeding is a necessary part of stopping night waking. So I'm not saying that it will lead to a reduction in night waking, but sometimes you have to reduce the night feeds in order to get more sleep. Now, this might sound really obvious, because obviously, if you're up in the night feeding, then you're not sleeping. So by definition, if you want to get more sleep, you're probably going to have to not feed. Does that make sense? But it doesn't mean that doing one will lead to the other. It's just part of the process, and only when really, really desired by the family, with informed choice, right, with their consent, and because there are no other viable options. All right? So whenever somebody contacts me and says, I think I need to night wean, my 18-month-old is waking up every hour all night, sometimes we do need to reduce the night feeding, but not necessarily because I know it's going to stop night waking in 3 days. It won't. But it might be the bridge, mightn't it? Right? So I'm a pragmatist, folks. I believe in first doing no harm. My father was a military GP. I grew up all over the world, in the Far East and all over Europe. Whenever we were in the world, he had this old picture of the Hippocratic Oath, usually on the back of the bathroom door. So every single time you did your business in the loo, you were confronted with first do no harm in my house growing up. And I really believe it. That's why I don't believe in cry it out, because I don't believe we have enough evidence that it is not harmful. So first do no harm. But I also quite like the lesser of two evils principle, okay? Now, if somebody is really, really struggling and they are determined that breastfeeding is the problem, it's the scapegoat, they want to stop breastfeeding because they're desperate for sleep. And if somebody like you doesn't support them with a gentle strategy, what are they going to do? They would potentially go and seek out somebody who will be less gentle with them. So I also believe in the lesser of two evils principle. So I will support people to reduce night feeds that have become unsustainable or unmanageable for them. Okay? Hopefully that doesn't make you feel uncomfortable, but I really believe that actually if we can make breastfeeding more sustainable for families, often it improves the duration of breastfeeding for that family. Now, one of the things that I talk a lot about is determining the urgency of the problem. So we don't just go in with all of our tools for every single family. We want to try and find out where they're at, don't we? And this is a really simple way of thinking about it. So I kind of split this into 4, and I want to talk you through kind of what we do at each of these particular time points for people. And some people may never get beyond sort of step 1. I hope not. I would love it if nobody ever needed to do anything about their child's sleep. That would be amazing. So we start with parental validation, okay? You're awesome. You are an amazing human. You're doing a great job of raising this beautiful baby that you have. Well done. Your baby is entirely normal. What they're doing right now is what babies have been doing for millions of years. You haven't broken them. You're a completely fantastic parent. And if you haven't said that to your client, please say it. I often share the story that I wasn't told well done with my first child until she was 8 months old. And I'd had numerous interactions with healthcare professionals, and it wasn't until she was 8 months old that someone said, well done, you're doing a great job. Please tell people well done, wherever they're at. It's the first thing to do. It's really easy. We can normalise, we can reassure, we can praise. The next thing we might need to do is additional support. Okay, that's where you rope people in. That's where you might learn how to do sling naps. Okay, I've seen so many sling napping babies, it warms my heart the last 2 days. It's the best place for a nap, right? So let's get naps happening. Let's not worry about where they're happening. Let's just get them happening. Yeah? We could talk about safe bed sharing. We could talk about how to make breastfeeding easier. What about some of those breastfeeding hacks like breast compressions, just to make the feed more effective, more efficient? There's lots of things that we can do. And we could improve parental sleep. This is something I love to do with parents. Working on an adult's sleep is so much easier than working on a little human's sleep. It's easier to change adult behaviour. Adapting our expectations, adapting our practices, adapting our bedtime, adapting our sleep environment, doing whatever we need to do to make sleep more easy to achieve for a parent is a good next step. And then we might need to move on then. Actually, if they're beginning to really struggle, maybe some basic sleep strategies. I absolutely, in general, hate talking about prescribed sleep times. I really hate it because sleep should always be individual to children. Children usually give individual tired cues, don't you, right? Some children rub their eyes, some children helpfully yawn. However, have you also met, there are two problems with just relying on individual baby cues. One is that some parents take a little bit of time to feel confident reading those cues and becoming attuned to their baby. Sometimes they need help understanding what that cue means. Have you run into people who they're feeding constantly and they don't understand why their baby's so fussy, and it's because they've interpreted lots of moaning as hunger, and they then begin to doubt their milk supply, and actually all that's wrong is their baby's really tired and just wants to be cuddled in close and helped to have a nap. Have you met those people too? I meet a lot of those people. And the other problem is some babies really don't give you a lot of help with tired cues. Have you also met those? Right? Some babies literally seem to go from 0 to 60 and all of a sudden they're shrieking and you think, oh my gosh, we've missed the window. I don't know how we missed the window because you were fine literally 2 minutes ago, but we've missed the window. And then what you get is a cranky baby who's very difficult to settle, haven't you? I won't bore you with why. So we might need to suggest, actually, why don't you just try a nap a little earlier? Why don't we try spacing the naps in a different way? Why don't we try an earlier bedtime? Why don't we try a different bedtime? Why don't we try a bedtime routine? It's amazing how often people don't do one, even though it's really basic sounding. Or we could overlap some new sleep cues. That's another really easy thing to do. If parents are becoming fed up with always being the one to have to put their baby to sleep because it requires the breast, then why not overlap some new ones? Help the baby to accept other ways of being soothed to sleep other than breastfeeding. Does that sound okay? I meet a lot of parents who are going back to work and they're really worried that when they're back at work, how is their baby going to fall asleep? Because they've always depended on the breast. So sometimes just ahead of time, maybe a month in advance, just overlapping some new cues just helps the baby accept another way of falling asleep that doesn't cause them any distress. And then this is what I spend a lot of my time dealing with. It's the sleep crisis. This is unmanageable, it's unsustainable. These are people who feel like they're going to die from lack of sleep. Have you met those people? Or have you felt like, have you ever wondered if you could die from lack of sleep? I've honestly wondered if I could die because I'm so tired. Or do you meet people who are so obsessed with sleep because they are so exhausted that they literally spend their entire day thinking about when their next sleep opportunity is going to be, begging their child to nap because all they want is 10 minutes to shut their eyes. Have you met those people too? And at this point, telling them, you're doing a great job, don't worry, this is normal, it'll pass. Do you agree that that's not very compassionate? It's not appropriate. Yes, of course we would say, oh my goodness, you're amazing. That sounds really tough. We would certainly do the reassurance and validation piece. This is not your fault. This is not your fault. You're not broken and your baby's not broken. But oh my goodness, this sounds hard. We can do that, but then we probably need to do something else as well. Because do you remember that somebody might blame a scapegoat at this point? So breastfeeding is at this point at risk, okay? So what do? I like to keep this simple for people. Number one rule is it still needs to respect the child's age and developmental stage and their need for responsiveness. We never ignore children, we never leave them alone, and we never don't respond to their calls for attention. And there are really only 4 basic things that you can do, right? That you'll see lots of complicated strategies and tools, but there are really only 4 basic things. You can change the bedtime routine. Okay, you can reorganize it in some way. So, for example, if breastfeeding to sleep is driving a parent crazy, well, why don't we just move it to the beginning of the routine? Okay, they're still getting their breastfeed, but then somebody else can cuddle to sleep. Okay, we can just change the order a little bit. That's okay. We could change the location. And I'm not talking about moving them out into another room. I'm talking about a really small change in location. We could go from falling asleep at the breast to falling asleep in arms. We could talk about falling asleep chest to chest, lying down in bed. Have you met parents who are sleeping in that unsafe way? We could help them move from that to sleeping more safely by the side of the parent. We could help them get from co-sleeping to perhaps a mattress on the floor. I'm talking about really small changes in location. Then we could change the person, okay? Now sometimes when yes, I hear you. I hear that roar. Yeah, that's what we could do. So we could also change the person. If we have another parent around, if we have a co-parent, if we have a doula, if we have a helpful grandparent, we could ask them if they could come and help. Could they just give that exhausted parent 3 or 4 hours of consolidated, solid sleep? Now, if you've been having minutes of sleep, like many of my clients are, they are literally achieving minutes of sleep every night. 4 or 5 hours consolidated sleep feels like a weekend spa break, right? I don't know if anyone here has ever had a night where they can honestly say they've had less than an hour's sleep. Anyone here? It is absolutely horrendous, especially if it's been going on for weeks or months. Having 4 hours, you feel like you can probably run for Parliament. Or maybe not right now, but maybe you'd need 6 hours for that. Maybe that's the problem. Hey, maybe they need some more sleep. Sorry. But actually, you could change the person, okay? That's a sensible thing to do. Or you could change the response, okay? I don't mean leave them to cry. I don't mean just take away something, but we could do something different. We could, instead of rock, we could hold still. I've just supported the parents of a beautiful little boy with Down syndrome who's 2 and has never slept more than 45 minutes his whole life. And all they did in the end was, instead of breastfeed to sleep, they got Daddy to rock this little one to sleep. That's all they did. I promise you, I did nothing clever because she was so broken, so broken. And he's now sleeping 4 hours at the beginning of the night. And he's never slept more than 45 minutes his whole life. He didn't cry while Daddy was rocking him at the beginning of the night. And she got 4 hours. He then woke up at midnight, and he woke up at 3, and then he woke up in the morning at 7. She's totally fine with that. There we go. That's all we need to do sometimes. Just change the person, change the response. But it always has to be with informed choice, doesn't it, folks? Always. Now, what about crying? I can never really give a talk about sleep without talking about crying, okay? I hate crying. Anyone here enjoy the sound of a baby crying? you know, nobody likes it. We're hardwired, aren't we, as a species, to respond to the sound of babies crying? Aren't we? It's a survival mechanism. It's not a good idea for a baby to be crying on their own. But is all crying bad? Is all crying bad? I'm not going to answer that question. I just want you to think about it. Is all crying bad? And at what age might we need to have a different perspective on it? Is it okay to cry in arms rather than crying alone? Is that better? Is that better and kinder for a baby? And sometimes, you know, if you've ever had a really unsettled baby, a really ill baby, a really fractious baby for any reason, sometimes you know that you do all the things and they're still crying, right? You've tried breastfeeding them, you've tried burping, you've tried walking around the room, you've bounced, you've given them the other boob, then, you know, you've done all the things, they're still crying. Sometimes we just need to accept that as parents, it's our responsibility to respond to crying, right? It's not necessarily our job to stop all crying, though. That's not maybe sustainable for everybody, okay? We can't always stop all crying. Sometimes we just need to hold space for that baby, don't we? And say, I hear you. You're having a bad day, I get it. I totally get that. I'm here for you, I love you. We don't need to feel responsibility to make it stop. If we've tried the things, we've been responsive, we've been gentle, maybe the crying won't stop. That's okay. That's okay. If we're there with them, if we're there for them, that's okay. So, I'm going to summarise. In a crisis, what we want to do is we want to be practical. We want to give our emotional and practical first aid, but we want to also throw them a rope. Okay, if somebody is treading water and they're not in a crisis, it's okay to tell them to keep going. That's okay. If they are drowning and they're in a crisis, we need to throw them a rope. We can't tell them to keep going because they won't be able to. Okay? And I want to put it to you that sleep is a public health priority. Right? Does anyone here feel like they could use a bit more sleep and they don't have a child to blame? Right? That's the sad truth, isn't it? Often once you've got your children sleeping, you're still tired. No one warns you about that. I'm sorry to burst anyone's bubble there. But often we need to use a combination of strategies at this point. So we need the emotional and practical first aid. We might need to set up a floor bed. You know what? Floor beds are great. I'm a massive fan. They avoid that stupid transfer. Who gets annoyed by a baby falling asleep in arms and then you do the wretched transfer and then they're awake and you have to start again? Floor beds avoid that. They're just because you can just lie next to them and cuddle and soothe and feed and then sneak away. Can't you? But whatever works, finding some quick fixes, fiddling with naps, fiddling with the bedtime. Okay, I want to leave you. I promise, where are the organisers? They're around all over the place. I promise you this is my last slide, but I want to finish on stress relief. I spend an extraordinary amount of time talking about stress relief for families because babies are incredibly intuitive, aren't they? They know when you're stressed, when you're fed up, when you've had it up to here with either them or their sleep or just life in general. They know. And often, if you can work on a parent's anxiety, if you can work on a parent's mental health, their feelings of self-efficacy, their feelings of empowerment, often what happens is you reduce their stress and you improve everybody's sleep. I often talk about sleep being an outcome, not a goal for families, because actually if you just make parents feel better, if you make the family feel better and tighter and more connected and more confident, usually the side effect is better sleep. Because have you found that the more you stress out about sleep, the worse it gets? I meet families who they literally spend their entire day trying to get their child to sleep. And I would hypothesize that the child's really bored of being told they must be tired and they need a sleep. I would be really bored to be repetitively told, you're tired, you need to go to bed now. So often taking the focus off sleep and onto stress management is a real game changer, okay? And there are lots of things that might reduce stress for your families. You probably know about some of this stuff. I'm just going to leave you with one tool, okay? And we're going to do it together. I've got a 5-hour drive, so I need some stress relief in my life right now before I head into that. we're going to try some alternate nostril breathing. It's such an easy thing to teach parents. Does anyone here know what it is? Any yoga teachers? Yes. Fantastic. So this is where I hope I don't get it completely wrong. But this is clinically proven to reduce blood pressure, heart rate and respiratory rate. And when you do those things, you actually feel better. Now, ideally, in research studies, they've done alternate nostril breathing for between 5 and 15 minutes. We're not going to do that because Janelle will have 50 fits. We're going to just do maybe a minute. Okay, so work with me. If you've got chronic sinus issues, just apologise to the person next to you because there may be some snorting. But I'm just trying to avoid that light. It's horrendous, isn't it? I'll go back over here. Forward. No. Oh, I have to be in your face, though. That's not great. I'll just stay where I am. It's all good. It's all good. It's all good. I'm a big girl. I can cope. What I want you to do is cover up one nostril, okay? We're all doing that. Then I want you to exhale through your free side. So exhale. And now inhale back through the same side. And then cover up the other nostril, and then exhale. And then inhale. And then exhale. And then inhale. And then exhale. Anything that draws your focus to your breath, whether you're doing it perfectly or imperfectly, is probably going to make you feel better. Leave parents with something small that they can do. The other one that I leave them with sometimes is an oxytocin pressure point. You all know where an easy one is? Has anyone ever done this? Okay, it's the base of the fleshy part between, there are lots of other pressure points, by the way. This is the most socially appropriate one, by the way. Just saying. So it's quite far down. It's almost uncomfortable to pinch that deep fleshy part of your thumb, and that will trigger an oxytocin pressure point. Anything that you can do to reduce stress will improve sleep. Okay, so there we go. I promise. I think we're just about on time. I think we need to listen to parents. I think we need to hold space for parents. I think we need to think about shifting the focus from sleep to connection and confidence and de-stressing. Good luck and stay in touch. Thank you.
A huge thank you to Lindsay and to all of our speakers, and I'm like on such a high now. I can't wait to go home and go to sleep though. Thank you to everyone that's come and made this event what it is. We have your, if you wanted a certificate, we have your certificate at the front desk. If you can drop your lanyards, we're hoping to use them again for future events. And any of the feedback forms that you have, we can fill those out as well. We have a few things that we found, party and some other bits that have been left around, and we put them at the desk. So if you're missing anything, or if you just want to have a quick look and see if you've left anything. But yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello.
I could pick your brain a little bit, if that's all right.
Only because you're kind of reason.
Oh my God. Tell me how to make him sleep.